Can a single man, frozen in position for 3 days and nights, change the outcome of an entire military front? This is the extraordinary true story of Sergeant Matthias Hetzenauer, an Austrian sniper whose impossible vigil in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front became one of the most remarkable feats of endurance and marksmanship in World War II history. February 1945. The Carpathian Mountains, Eastern Hungary. The Third Reich is collapsing, but here, in these snow-covered peaks, desperate men still fight with everything they have. The German 3rd Mountain Division holds, critical past the last gateway, protecting the retreat of nearly 40,000 German troops withdrawing from the Soviet advance. If this position falls, an entire army will be encircled and destroyed. And standing between survival and annihilation is one Austrian marksman with a Carabiner 98K rifle, about to undertake a mission that military historians still debate as either brilliant strategy or absolute madness. Matthias Hetzenauer was not born to be a warrior. The 22-year-old from Tyrol had grown up hunting chamois in the Alps with his grandfather, learning patience and precision in the unforgiving mountain environment. Those skills had made him a natural when he was conscripted into the Wehrmacht's elite Gebirgsgruppe, the mountain troops in 1943. By February 1945, Hetzenauer had already achieved 345 confirmed kills, making him one of the deadliest snipers on the Eastern Front. But numbers alone don't tell his story. What set him apart was something his commanding officer, Hauptmann Wilhelm Bauer, had recognized immediately: an almost supernatural ability to become part of the landscape itself. The strategic situation was catastrophic. Army Group South had been shattered by the Soviet Debrecen offensive. The Red Army's 2nd Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, was pushing westward with overwhelming force, nearly 500,000 men, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. The Wehrmacht's retreat was turning into a rout. But there was one narrow corridor through the Carpathians, the Jablonica Pass, that could save what remained of the German forces in Hungary. Control this pass and 40,000 men might escape to fight another day. Lose it and they would be surrounded, cut off, annihilated. The 3rd Mountain Division had been tasked with holding this pass for 72 hours. Just 3 days. That's all the time needed for the main forces to withdraw through the mountains to defensive positions in Austria. 3 days that would require every ounce of courage, skill, and sacrifice the mountain troops could muster. Hauptmann Bauer studied the terrain maps with growing concern. Intelligence reports indicated that Soviet reconnaissance units were probing the approaches to the pass. Once they identified the German defensive positions, the full weight of a Soviet division would come crashing down. The thin German line, barely 2 companies of exhausted Gebirgs, couldn't hope to stop a determined assault. They needed advance warning. They needed to disrupt Soviet reconnaissance. They needed a miracle. They needed Matthias Hetzenauer. The briefing took place in a half-collapsed farmhouse on February 11, 1945 at 0400 hours. Bauer spread the map across a table scarred by shrapnel, his breath visible in the frigid air. There's a ridgeline here. He pointed to a spot 3 kilometers forward of the main German position, height 847. It overlooks the entire Soviet approach route through the valley. From there, a skilled marksman could observe their movements, eliminate their scouts, and delay their advance long enough for us to prepare. Hetzenauer studied the map silently. The ridge was isolated, exposed, surrounded by enemy territory. There would be no support, no reinforcement, no extraction. If things went wrong, how long? He asked quietly. 3 days, 72 hours. You'll be completely alone out there. No radio. The Soviets have direction-finding equipment that could locate you. No fires, no unnecessary movement. You'll have to remain in position regardless of weather, regardless of enemy activity. Can you do this? Hetzenauer looked at the map for a long moment, then nodded once. I'll need extra ammunition and white camouflage netting. By 0600 hours, as false dawn began to illuminate the mountains, Hetzenauer was moving through the forest like a ghost. He carried his Carabiner 98K with its Zeiss ZF-42 scope. 400 rounds of 7.92 millimeters ammunition, 3 days of cold rations, 2 canteens, a white camouflage smock, and a prayer that he might see his home again. The temperature was minus 18 degrees Celsius. A brutal wind swept down from the north, carrying particles of ice that stung exposed skin like needles. Hetzenauer moved deliberately, methodically, leaving minimal tracks in the deep snow. Every 50 meters, he paused to listen, to observe, to ensure he wasn't walking into a Soviet patrol. It took him 4 hours to reach, Height 847. The ridge was exactly as the maps had shown, a rocky outcrop, offering commanding views of the valley below, but exposed to the elements and dangerously visible to anyone who knew where to look. Hetzenauer selected a position among a cluster of boulders on the northern face, where natural shadows and rock formations would break up his silhouette. For the next 3 hours, he worked with painstaking care to construct his hide. Using the white camouflage netting and natural materials, branches, rocks, snow, he created a shallow nest that would blend perfectly with the surrounding terrain. The position was barely large enough for his body, offering no room to move, no possibility of comfort. This would be his entire world for the next 72 hours. By 1300 hours on February 11th, Hetzenauer was in position. Through his rifle scope, he could see the valley stretching below 3 kilometers of open ground that the Soviets would have to cross to reach the pass. He could see the ruined village of Haram Huta in the distance, where Soviet forward elements were likely based. He could see the frozen stream that snaked through the valley floor, its surface covered in snow. And then he saw them. At 1410 hours, movement caught his attention. Soviet scouts for men in white winter camouflage, moving cautiously through the tree line approximately 800 meters away. They were good, moving with tactical discipline, using cover effectively. But Hetzenauer was better. He didn't shoot, not yet. He watched, breathing slowly, rhythmically, becoming one with the cold stone around him. He observed their pattern of movement, their hand signals, their destination. They were mapping the German approaches, identifying positions for their artillery observers. At 1437 hours, he took his first shot. The lead scout dropped instantly, a clean hit to the center mass at 823 meters. The other 3 scattered, diving for cover, confusion evident in their panicked movements. Hetzenauer worked the bolt smoothly, acquired the second target, squeezed the trigger, another hit. The remaining 2 scouts were running now, abandoning their mission, desperate to escape the invisible marksman who had materialized from nowhere. He let them go, let them spread fear among their comrades, let them report that the approaches to the pass were guarded by a phantom. As darkness fell on the first night, the temperature plummeted to minus 23 degrees Celsius. Hetzenauer couldn't move, couldn't build a fire, couldn't do anything that might reveal his position. He could only lie there, wrapped in his camouflage, feeling the cold seep into his bones with relentless, brutal efficiency. The human body isn't designed for this. Prolonged exposure to extreme cold triggers a cascade of physiological responses, vasoconstriction, as blood retreats. From the extremities, violent shivering as muscles attempt to generate warmth, the gradual onset of hypothermia as core temperature drops. Hetzenauer had trained for cold weather operations, but training and reality are vastly different things. By midnight, he had lost feeling in his toes. His fingers were numb inside his gloves, making the operation of his rifle difficult. His jaw ached from clenching his teeth to prevent them from chattering. But he remained still, disciplined, focused on the mission. February 12th, 6:17 hours. Dawn arrived with brutal clarity. The sky was cloudless, the sun reflecting off the snow with blinding intensity. Hetzenauer's eyes, exposed to the cold all night, felt like they were filled with ground glass. But through his scope, he could see Soviet activity increasing in the valley. At 08 for 3 hours, a Soviet reconnaissance patrol, this time with 12 men, better armed, moving with greater caution, advanced through the valley. They were searching for him, trying to locate the sniper who had killed their scouts the previous day. Hetzenauer watched them come, his heart rate never rising above 60 beats per minute, his breathing controlled and steady. When they were 600 meters away, he began his work. The first shot dropped their officer. The second killed the radio operator. The third and fourth targeted the machine gunners. The patrol dissolved into chaos, men diving for cover, returning fire blindly toward the ridgeline, but they couldn't see him. His position was perfect, his camouflage flawless. By 0900 hours, the patrol had withdrawn, leaving 5 bodies in the snow. At 11:34 hours, Soviet artillery began ranging shots on the ridgeline. Shells screamed overhead, detonating among the rocks with thunderous violence. Shrapnel whined through the air, chunks of stone exploding from the boulders around Hetzenauer's position. He pressed himself flat, making himself as small as possible, praying that none of the randomly falling death would find him. The barrage lasted 23 minutes. When it finally stopped, his ears were ringing, his head pounding, fine dust covering every surface of his hide. But he was alive, and his position was intact. The Soviets had been firing blind, unable to pinpoint his exact location. Throughout the second day, Hetzenauer continued his deadly work. A Soviet sniper team at 14:02 hours both eliminated before they could set up their position. An artillery observation team at 15:48 hours 3 kills that prevented the Soviets from directing accurate fire onto the German defensive positions. A squad attempting to flank through the forest at 17:23 hours for more casualties that sent them retreating in disorder. By the end of the second day, February 12th, Hetzenauer had fired 47 rounds. 32 confirmed kills. The Soviet advance through the valley had been effectively halted, their reconnaissance efforts completely disrupted. But the cost to Hetzenauer himself was becoming catastrophic. He could no longer feel his feet. His hands were so numb that manipulating the rifle bolt required conscious effort for each movement. His lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. Dehydration was setting in. His water had frozen solid in the canteens, and he was reduced to eating handfuls of snow, which only made the cold worse. His body was consuming itself, burning through precious calories in a desperate attempt to maintain core temperature. The second night was worse than the first. The temperature dropped to minus 26 degrees Celsius. A wind picked up, howling through the rocks, driving the cold through every layer of clothing. Hetzenauer's body had stopped shivering, a danger sign indicating that hypothermia was progressing toward life-threatening stages. He began to hallucinate. Shadows moved in the darkness that weren't really there. He heard voices speaking in German, calling his name, telling him to come down from the ridge. His mind, starved of warmth and rest, was beginning to fracture. But through it all, some core part of him, the hunter who had stalked chamois through alpine blizzards, the soldier who had sworn an oath, the man who knew that 40,000 lives depended on him, held on. Just hold on. Just survive until dawn. It's one more day. February 13th, 05:34 hours. The third day began with disaster. Hetzenauer woke from a brief, fitful period of unconsciousness to find that he couldn't move his left leg. The combination of cold and immobility had caused such severe tissue damage that his entire lower leg was frozen, literally frozen, inside his boot. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. If he couldn't move, he was finished. The Soviets would find him, or the cold would kill him, or both. He forced the panic down through sheer willpower. Slowly, agonizingly, he began massaging his leg through his trousers, trying to restore circulation. The pain, when feeling started to return, was excruciating like hot needles, being driven through every nerve. He bit down on a piece of leather from his rifle sling to keep from crying out. At 06:47 hours, through the scope, he saw something that made his blood run even colder than it already was. The Soviets weren't sending scouts anymore. They were sending everything. A full battalion-strength assault was forming up in the valley, at least 400 men, supported by 6 T-34 tanks and multiple support weapons. This wasn't reconnaissance. This was the main attack, the hammer blow that would smash through the pass and encircle the German forces. They had waited 3 days, suffered dozens of casualties from the Phantom sniper, and now they were done with caution. They were coming in overwhelming force, and nothing, certainly not one frozen Austrian marksman, was going to stop them. Hetzenauer watched them assemble through his scope, his mind racing through options. He had perhaps 50 rounds remaining. Even if every shot was a kill, he couldn't stop this. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and undeniable, but he could delay them. He could make them pay for every meter. Most importantly, he could warn the main defensive position. At 07:12 hours, the Soviet assault began. The tanks moved forward first, their engines roaring in the cold morning air, crushing through the snow. Infantry followed in their wake, dancing in extended line formation, a wall of men and steel rolling inexorably toward the pass. Hetzenauer aimed for the tank commanders. They rode exposed in their cupolas, directing their vehicles. 700 meters, he fired. The first commander slumped forward. The tank continued, but more slowly, button up, its situational awareness reduced. He worked the bolt, acquired the second commander, fired. Another hit. The Soviet infantry was spreading out now, moving faster, using cover more effectively. They had finally located his position. The muzzle flashed from his rifle. The impact of bullets had given him away. Machine gun fire began raking the ridgeline, bullets cracking off the rocks around him, throwing up clouds of stone fragments. Hetzenauer shifted position slightly within his hide, enough to gain a different angle. He began targeting officers and NCOS, the men with binoculars, the men giving orders, the men coordinating the assault. At 07:09 hours, a Soviet major organizing his company for a flanking movement. At 07:01 hours, a senior sergeant directing machine gun fire. At 07:56 hours, a political officer trying to rally troops who were taking cover from the invisible marksman. The Soviet advance slowed, then stopped entirely. 400 men had gone to ground, unwilling to advance into the teeth of fire that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Officers screamed orders, threatened consequences, but the basic survival instinct of trained soldiers had taken over. Nobody wanted to be the next target. At 08 to 3 hours, the Soviets called in artillery. This time, it wasn't ranging shots. This was a full-scale barrage designed to obliterate the ridgeline and everything on it. The first shells screamed in, impacting with devastating precision. Ground shook, the air filled with the stench of cordite and pulverized rock. Hetzenauer pressed himself into the smallest possible space in his hide, making peace with death. The explosions walked across the ridgeline, each one closer than the last, the overpressure from the blasts threatening to rupture his lungs. A shell exploded less than 10 meters away, and the concussion lifted him bodily, slamming him against the rocks. Blood ran from his nose and ears. His vision swam with black spots. The barrage lasted 14 minutes. When it finally stopped, Hetzenauer slowly, painfully, raised his head. His hide was partially collapsed, his rifle was buried in debris, and every part of his body screamed in agony. But he was alive, and the Soviets were advancing again. At 08 for 1 hour, they came forward with renewed determination. The tanks had closed to within 400 meters. Infantry was at 500 meters and closing fast. Hetzenauer dug his rifle out of the debris with hands that barely functioned. The scope had been cracked by shell fragments. The lens spiderwebbed but still marginally usable. He had 19 rounds remaining. 19 bullets to stop 400 men and 6 tanks. The mission was over. He had done everything humanly possible and more. Now it was simply a question of selling his life as dearly as possible. He centered the cracked scope on a Soviet captain, leading his men forward, and squeezed the trigger. The captain fell. 18 rounds remaining. A sergeant rushing to fill the leadership vacuum. 17 rounds. A machine gunner setting up his weapon. 16 rounds. Each shot was a prayer, a defiant shout against the inevitable. Hetzenauer had transcended physical pain, transcended fear, transcended everything except the cold precision of the marksman's art. He had become pure function, pure purpose, a machine that converted ammunition into Soviet casualties with mechanical efficiency. But it wasn't enough. Soviets were through his field of fire now, advancing on the main German positions. The tanks were grinding forward, their machine guns chattering. The battle for the pass was about to begin, and the thin German line was about to be swept away. At 09:03 hours, with 11 rounds remaining, Hetzenauer heard something that made him think he was hallucinating again. Aircraft engines. It's a distinctive, powerful drone of multiple heavy engines approaching from the west. They came in low and fast. 12 Junkers Ru, 87 Stuka dive bombers. Their fixed landing gear giving them their distinctive appearance, their sirens beginning to wail as they tipped into their attack dives. Behind them came a squadron of Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters providing top cover. The Luftwaffe, written off as a spent force, thought to be completely destroyed, was here. Somehow, somewhere, someone had scraped together this strike force and sent it precisely where it was needed most. Later, Hetzenauer would learn that these aircraft represented the last operational squadron from Flieger Corps 4, flown by pilots who understood this was likely their final mission, burning fuel that didn't exist for a war that was already lost. But in this moment, on this ridge, for these trapped soldiers, they were salvation. The Stukas came screaming down on the Soviet armor with the fury of vengeful angels. The first T-34 exploded in a pillar of flame as a 500-kilogram bomb struck it directly. The second tank was caught by a near miss that flipped it onto its side, its track spinning uselessly in the air. The third tried to reverse, only to have its engine compartment torn apart by a direct hit. The FW-190s swept across the Soviet infantry positions, their cannons and machine guns tearing into the packed formations with devastating effect. Men, scattered, broke, ran for cover that didn't exist. The carefully organized Soviet assault dissolved into chaos in less than 3 minutes. But the Luftwaffe pilots weren't finished. They made pass after pass, expending every bomb, every bullet, every ounce of fuel they had. 2 Stukas were shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft firejets, and I watched them spiral into the valley, trailing smoke and flame. 1 FW-190 was hit and crash-landed in the trees, its pilot likely dead before impact. By 09 to 7 hours, the skies were empty again. The surviving aircraft limping back toward distant airfields they might not reach, but they had done their job. The Soviet assault had been shattered. Bodies and burning vehicles littered the valley. The survivors were in full retreat, abandoning their wounded, abandoning their equipment, abandoning all thought of pressing the attack. From the main German positions, Hetzenauer heard something he never thought he'd hear again: cheering. The mountain troops were cheering, shouting, firing their weapons in the air in celebration. They had held. Against impossible odds, they had held. At 0945 hours, Hauptmann Bauer and a squad of soldiers reached Hetzenauer's position on the ridge. What they found shocked them to silence. The Austrian sniper was still in his hide, still in firing position, his rifle aimed downrange. Couldn't stand, his legs wouldn't support him. Couldn't speak, his jaw was frozen shut. His exposed skin was gray-white with severe frostbite. His eyes, still tracking movement in the valley below, were those of a man who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. "Jesus Christ," one of the soldiers whispered. "He's been up here the whole time. 3 days. 3 goddamn days." They carried him down carefully, wrapped in blankets, trying desperately to warm him without causing shock that could stop his heart. Hetzenauer drifted in and out of consciousness during the descent, his mind still locked in the battle, still counting rounds, still calculating range and windage for targets that were no longer there. By 1200 hours, he was in the makeshift field hospital. Doctors working frantically to save his legs, his fingers, his life. The diagnosis was severe: frostbite affecting all extremities, stage 3 hypothermia, malnutrition, dehydration, partial hearing loss from artillery concussion, and a hairline fracture of 2 ribs from the shellfire. That he was alive at all was considered miraculous. That he had maintained his position and continued fighting was considered impossible. In his 3 days on height 847, Matthias Hetzenauer had fired 193 rounds. Intelligence officers, comparing his firing reports with Soviet casualty records recovered later, confirmed 97 kills. But more importantly, his presence had delayed the Soviet reconnaissance efforts by 48 hours, disrupted 3 major probing attacks, forced the main Soviet assault into a killing zone where the Luftwaffe strike could maximize its effect. The 3rd Mountain Division held the Jablanica Pass for 74 hours, 2 hours longer than required. In that time, the entire remnants of Army Group South's Hungarian contingent, 41,600 men, along with thousands of civilian refugees, passed through the corridor to safety. A single sniper, frozen in position, had changed the calculus of an entire front. Matthias Hetzenauer spent 6 weeks recovering from his ordeal. He lost 3 toes to frostbite and suffered permanent nerve damage in his hands that ended his career as a precision marksman. The doctors told him he was lucky another 4 hours on that ridge, and he would have lost both legs. Another 8 hours and he would have died. On March 17, 1945, in a ceremony held in a hospital ward in Austria, Hetzenauer was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the Wehrmacht's highest honor for valor. Hauptmann Bauer, reading the citation, had tears in his eyes as he described the actions of February 11th to 13th. The citation read, "In part, through extraordinary courage, unshakable determination, and tactical brilliance under conditions that would have broken any normal man, Sergeant Hetzenauer single-handedly delayed an enemy division, preserved the lives of 40,000 German soldiers and countless civilians, and demonstrated the highest traditions of the Gebirgsjäger. His actions constitute one of the most remarkable individual achievements of this war. But for Hetzenauer himself, there was no glory in what he had done. In the few interviews he gave after the war, he spoke only of duty, of his comrades, of the civilians, women, and children who had made it through the pass because he had held his position. He never spoke of heroism, never glorified the killing. War, he said, was a terrible thing that revealed both the worst and best of humanity. The Soviet records, captured after the war, provide their own testimony to his effectiveness. The 297th Rifle Division, tasked with breaking through the Jablanica Pass, reported in their after-action report, advance repeatedly disrupted by sniper fire of extraordinary accuracy. Casualties among reconnaissance elements and junior leadership were catastrophic. Unit morale severely affected by presence of unlocatable enemy marksmen. Recommend future operations include intensive counter-sniper protocol. Hetzenauer survived the war, returning to his beloved Austrian mountains. He never hunted again. The thought of killing, even animals, had become unbearable to him. He worked as a mountain guide, teaching young people to respect the power and beauty of the Alps. He married, raised children, and lived quietly until his death in 2004 at the age of 81. His final confirmed kill count for the war was 345, making him the 3rd highest scoring sniper in Wehrmacht history. But those who knew him said he never kept count, never celebrated the number. Each one, he told his family, represented someone's son, brother, father, Each one was a tragedy made necessary by the greater tragedy of war. The carabiner 98K rifle he carried during those 3 frozen days scopes still cracked from shell fragments. Stock scarred by battle damages now housed in the Austrian Military Museum in Vienna. A small plaque tells the story of height 847. But the simple object cannot convey the true measure of what happened on that ridge. What it can convey is this: when everything seemed lost, when the mathematics of war suggested only defeat, one man chose to hold his ground, not for glory, not for victory, but because others depended on him. And sometimes in the darkest moments of history, that choice makes all the difference. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. From the frozen ridges of the Carpathians to the burning deserts of North Africa, from the depths of the Atlantic to the skies over Germany, millions of individuals faced impossible choices and demonstrated extraordinary courage. Their stories deserve to be remembered, their sacrifices honored, their humanity recognized. Subscribe to WWII Secrets Reborn as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Because history isn't just about grand strategies and famous generals, it's about people like Matthias Hetzen, ordinary individuals who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and showed us what the human spirit is, truly capable of when tested beyond all reasonable limits.